My Weirder-est School. Book number 12. Lil Mouse is in the House. Written by Dan Gutman. Pictures by Jim Pellock. Chapter 1. The Truth About Page 23. My name is AJ, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking about clams, because that's what I'm thinking about. The other day, my mom said I looked like I was happy as a clam. What? How does she know that clams are happy? I bet there are a lot of sad clams out there. I know that if I was a clam, I'd be sad. Who wants to sit around in the mud all day waiting for some walrus to eat you? The point is, it was June 1st, and you know what that means? It means the next day would be June 2nd. June 1st also means that school is almost over for the year. And that means 3rd grade is almost over. Yay! Boy, 3rd grade sure took a long time. I feel like I've been in 3rd grade for 14 years. I had just put my backpack in my cubby when our teacher, Mr. Cooper, came flying into the room. And I do mean flying. Mr. Cooper thinks he's a superhero, and he wears a cape. That's weird. As usual, he tripped over somebody's umbrella, fell down, and almost took out a row of desks. I'm fine, Mr. Cooper said as he brushed the dirt off his pants. Then, like every day, we pledged the allegiance and did word of the day. Okay, said Mr. Cooper. Turn to page 23 in your math books. Ugh, I hate math. Why do we need math when we have calculators? I didn't bother getting out my math book or turning to page 23. Why should I? Every time Mr. Cooper tells us to turn to page 23 in our math books, there's some interruption. It's always an announcement over the loudspeaker telling us to go to the all-purpose room or the playground for a surprise assembly. Mr. Cooper has been trying to teach us page 23 all year. I'm sure it's some really hard math problem. So I just sat there while everybody else got out their math books. AJ, said Mr. Cooper, why aren't you taking out your math book? What's the point? I replied. There's gonna be an announcement. You'll see. I looked at the loudspeaker on the wall. There was no announcement. Andrea Young, this annoying girl with curly brown hair, got out her math book and turned to page 23. Ryan, who will eat anything, got out his math book and turned to page 23. Michael, who never ties his shoes, got out his math book and turned to page 23. I waited, and waited, and waited. No announcement! I was starting to get nervous. Neil, who we call the nude kid even though he wears clothes, got out his math book and turned to page 23. Crybaby Emily got out her math book and turned to page 23. Alexia, this girl who rides a skateboard all the time, got out her math book and turned to page 23. Everybody was taking out their math books and turning to page 23. Everybody except me. AJ, said Mr. Cooper, there isn't going to be an announcement this morning. I checked with the office. Please take out your math book and turn to page 23. No, I said. Mr. Cooper put his hands on his hips. When a grown-up puts their hands on their hips, you know they're mad at you. Nobody knows why. Dude, Ryan whispered to me, you won't believe what's on page 23. It's gonna blow your mind, AJ, said Michael. Ryan and Michael usually know what they're talking about. So I took out my math book. I turned to page 23. And you'll never believe in 1,100,000 years what was on page 23. I'm not gonna tell you. Okay, I'll tell you. It said, 2 plus 2 equals... What? Are you kidding me? That's what's on page 23? All these years, I've been worried about what was on page 23, and it was just 2 plus 2 equals... Any dumbhead knows what 2 plus 2 is. 4, grammar, everybody shouted. Mr. Cooper closed his math book. Very good, he said. Now that we've finished page 23, I think you kids are ready for 4th grade. You'll never believe what happened next. An announcement came over the loudspeaker. But I'm not going to tell you what it was. Okay, I'll tell you. But you have to read the next chapter, so na-na-na-boo-boo on you. Chapter 2. All the good ones are dead. The announcement was from Mrs. Patty, our school secretary. 3rd graders, said Mrs. Patty, please report to the media center. We walked 1,100,000 miles to the media center, which used to be called the library, but they changed the name. Nobody knows why. Mrs. Rupee was waiting for us at the door. She's our media specialist. She used to be called the librarian, but they changed the name. Nobody knows why. Good morning, everyone, said Mrs. Rupee. I'm so excited that you kids are graduating from 3rd grade. Congratulations! I have some good news and some better news for you. What's the good news? Asked Neil. The good news is that I'm going to be in charge of your graduation. Yay! We all shouted. What's the better news? Asked Alexia. The better news is that Mrs. Stoker said I could bring in a guest speaker for your graduation. Yay! We all shouted. Mrs. Stoker is our new principal. The principal used to be Mr. Klutz, but he retired. A couple of years ago, I went to my sister's graduation, so I know that graduations are a total snooze fest. You have to sit around for 1,100,000 hours waiting for your name to be called. Then they hand you this piece of paper that your parents stick in your memory box for the rest of your life. Snore. Hang on, said Mrs. Rupee. I'll be right back. I have to make a quick phone call. She dashed out of the room, so I did what I always do when there are no teachers around. I stood up on my chair and shook my butt at the class. Arlo, sit down, said Andrea, rolling her eyes. She calls me by my real name because she knows I don't like it. A few minutes later, Mrs. Rupee came back. The weird thing was she didn't look like Mrs. Rupee anymore. She was dressed like a man with a bushy mustache, glasses, and a jacket and tie. She must have stuffed a pillow under her shirt because she looked a lot bigger. Why are you dressed like that, Mrs. Rupee? Asked Ryan. Who's Mrs. Rupee? Said Mrs. Rupee. Never heard of her. My name is Teddy Roosevelt. I was the 26th President of the United States. My face is on Mount Rushmore. Mrs. Rupee is loopy. Teddy Roosevelt died like 1,100,000 years ago. We all knew it was just Mrs. Rupee dressed up like Teddy Roosevelt. Well, almost all of us knew it. You're my favorite president, said Emily, who will fall for anything. May I be the speaker at your graduation? Asked Mrs. Teddy Roosevelt. I'll tell you stories of my days as a trust buster. Trust buster? I didn't know what he was talking about. I looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at Alexia. Alexia looked at Neil. Neil looked at Andrea. We were all looking at each other. I'll tell you what, Teddy Roosevelt said. You kids think it over. I have to go bust some trusts. Huh? What's a trust? And why would anybody want to bust one? Teddy Roosevelt ran out of the room. A few minutes later, Mrs. Rupee came back, wearing her regular clothes. Okay, I finished my phone call, she told us. As I was saying, we're going to have a guest speaker at your graduation. Teddy Roosevelt was just here, Emily shouted excitedly. He said he had to go bust some trusts. Really? Said Mrs. Rupee. Teddy Roosevelt is my hero. I've got to go get his autograph before he leaves the building. She went running out of the room again. A few minutes later, Mrs. Rupee came back, She had gray hair and was wearing a plain black dress and granny glasses. "Who are you dressed up as now, Mrs. Rupee?" asked Andrea. "Who's Mrs. Rupee?" replied Mrs. Rupee. "My name is Susan B. Anthony. I was one of the first leaders in the fight for women's rights." "Cool," said Emily, who believes anything that anybody says. "May I be the speaker at your graduation?" asked Mrs. Rupee. Susan B. Anthony. I looked at Michael. Michael looked at Emily. Emily looked at Andrea. Andrea looked at Ryan. We were all looking at each other. "You kids think it over," said Susan B. Anthony. "I have to go fight for women's suffrage." "You want women to suffer?" I asked. "She said suffrage, dumbhead," Andrea said. "It means the right to vote." "I knew that," I lied. Susan B. Anthony ran out of the room. A few minutes later, Mrs. Rupee came back. She was wearing her regular clothes again. "Ooh, look," she said, waving a piece of paper. "I got Teddy Roosevelt's autograph. It was so exciting. I'm sweating." "Mrs. Rupee," shouted Emily, "you missed it. Susan B. Anthony was right here in the media center." "No way," said Mrs. Rupee. "She's my hero. This is so upsetting. Oh dear, I have to go, powder my nose." She went running out of the room again. "Why would anybody put powder on their nose?" I asked. "She isn't powdering her nose, dumbhead," said Andrea. "She went to the bathroom. When grown-ups don't want to say they need to go to the bathroom, they say they have to powder their noses." Grown-ups are weird. I was going to say something mean to Andrea, but I didn't get the chance because Mrs. Rupee came running back into the room. This time she was dressed as an old man with white hair and a bow tie. "Who are you now, Mrs. Rupee?" asked Alexia. "Who's Mrs. Rupee?" said Mrs. Rupee. "I'm Thomas Edison. I invented the light bulb, the phonograph, and lots of other things." "Wow," said Emily. "May I be the speaker at your graduation?" asked Mrs. Rupee. Thomas Edison. "Wait a minute. Isn't Thomas Edison dead?" asked Ryan. "All those people are dead," said Alexia. "How could any of them speak at our graduation?" "You know what they say," said Thomas Edison. "You can accomplish anything if you put your mind to it. That's how I got to be a great inventor. Oh, that reminds me. I have an idea for a new invention. Gotta run." Thomas Edison ran out of the room. A minute later, Mrs. Rupee came back. "Now, as I was saying, Thomas Edison was here," shouted Emily. "Really?" asked Mrs. Rupee. "He's my hero." "Yes," said Emily. "He asked us if he could speak at our graduation. So did Susan B. Anthony and Teddy Roosevelt." "What do you kids think?" asked Mrs. Rupee. "Which one of those people would you like to be the guest speaker?" "I don't want Teddy Roosevelt," said Ryan. "I don't want Susan B. Anthony," said Neil. "I don't want any of those old-timey dead people," said Alexia. "Well, who do you kids want to be the speaker at graduation?" asked Mrs. Rupee. I thought about it for a minute. "Joseph Gayety," I said. Everybody looked at me. "Who's Joseph Gayety?" asked Mrs. Rupee. "He was the guy who invented toilet paper," I explained. "I don't think Joseph Gayety will be available to speak at your graduation," said Mrs. Rupee. "Probably not. He's dead too. He invented toilet paper back in 1857. Don't ask me what people used before then." "Does anybody have another idea for a guest speaker?" asked Mrs. Rupee. "How about Mother Teresa?" suggested Emily. "She's dead," said Mrs. Rupee. "How about Martin Luther King Jr.?" suggested Alexia. Also dead, said Mrs. Rupee. How about Neil Armstrong? Suggested Neil. He was the first man on the moon. Dead, said Mrs. Rupee. Bummer in the summer. All the good ones are dead. But that's when I came up with the greatest idea in the history of the world. You know who we should get to speak at our graduation? I said. Lil Mouse. Lil Mouse, said Ryan. I love Lil Mouse. Lil Mouse is the coolest, said Michael. Yeah, can we get Lil Mouse to speak at graduation? Asked Alexia. Lil Mouse, Lil Mouse, Lil Mouse, we all started chanting. Chanting is cool. Who's Lil Mouse? Asked Mrs. Rupee. We all laughed. Everybody knows who Lil Mouse is. Well, every kid knows. Lil Mouse is the most popular singer and rapper in the world. Kids love him because he's really cool. Grown-ups love him because he doesn't say bad words. He always wears a mouse costume, so nobody knows what he looks like. His newest rap, The Happy Little Clam, is all over the internet. We told Mrs. Rupee all about Lil Mouse. I'm sorry, she said, but Mrs. Stoker would never let me have a rapper be the speaker at your graduation. Besides, it would cost a fortune to get a famous person like that. We don't have money to pay for a speaker, and Lil Mouse is probably too busy anyway. Boo! Everybody started booing. No fair. Kids never get to decide anything. It's our graduation. We should be allowed to pick the guest speaker. Bummer in the summer. This was going to be the worst graduation in the history of graduations.